Hello, I'm Carolyn Chalmers, and I was a co-editor of the ISO 37000 standard. This standard was published on the 14th of September, just last month. A little bit about the standard and the organization that developed the standard. The organization is, of course, ISO, the International Organization of Standardization. It was established just after the Second World War by the United Nations and currently reports into the United Nations Economic and Social Council. The primary purpose of ISO is to facilitate international trade. So when reading its standards, we need to bear this in mind. To participate in the development of standards, every country can establish national standards bodies, and those national standards bodies can nominate experts to participate in the work and the development of these international standards. Most ISO standards are management system standards. And here we think about ISO 9001, the quality management system standard, and then more recently, ISO 27000, the information security management systems. This standard was initiated in November 2016, and the work really commenced in May 2017. It started with an environmental scan that I was very fortunate to be the leader of. We looked at national codes and regulations across the world. We brought in academic materials as well as various appropriate publications. We had participation in the development of the standard from 77 countries, and those are represented in the slide you see in front of you. We also had participation from 83 global liaison organizations. These organizations are organizations such as the OECD, the Global Network of Directors Institutes, the International Institute of Internal Auditors, and many, many others, 83 of them. We achieved international consensus on the final publication as it's published, and we had 100% approval of the standard as it currently is published. That is something quite unusual in ISO with the international participation and international consensus building to have 100% approval. So what you see and what I'm explaining to you today has got global agreement, international consensus for the standard for guidance on the governance of organizations. As I said, the standard was published just last month on the 14th of September 2021. It is a guidance standard. It is not a management system standard, as it's not certifiable. An organization can't follow the standard and say that it's certified to be well governed or demonstrate good governance. It's not a certifiable standard. It is a guidance standard. And this is in recognition that governance across all organizations and all types of organizations really differs. And although we are in the process of developing several standards to assess the governance of organizations, this ISO 37000 standard is not certifiable. It is developed on the basis of principles, and those principles provide the guidance. Yes, in the standard, there are some key aspects of practices that organizations and their governing bodies should consider when applying the principles. But it is principled based. It's written using the term should, as opposed to using the term shall, being more of a certifiable management system approach. It also has identified outcomes. So as a result of the application of the principles in this guidance standard, this is what organizations should demonstrate as being good governance. So these outcomes that well-governed organizations can demonstrate. It is very much, as you've heard me say, governance and not management. And then just a reminder of the ISO purpose, and that's to facilitate international trade, as opposed to creating a more advanced body of academic knowledge. That's not what the standard intends. This standard intends for international agreement to be established on what good governance looks like, or what comprises an effectively governed organization. So how does the standard work with other national codes and national standards and other management system standards? Well, in ISO, we have already developed other standards for governance, other governance standards for governing bodies. And I think, for example, of the IT governance standard, ISO 38500. Now that standard, because it exists already, is going to be revised now that this kind of international consensus regarding the governance of organizations has been established. So any governance guidance standards that already exist in ISO are going to be revised in the context of this new guidance standard, using this 37,000 as a conceptual framework for those specific subject matters. When it comes to national codes, this is something that's very close to my heart, because in South Africa, where I come from, we have one of the most mature governance codes or reports internationally. And our latest version of our reports, King 4, is used across the African continent, and it is used in other countries as well. So how would our King reports be used in the context of the ISO 37000 standard? I'm fortunate to be the liaison to the King Committee. And of course, the King Committee and the King reports have been named after Professor Mervyn King. I'm liaison to the King Committee, and I'm also chairperson of the South African Bureau of Standards Technical Committee, working on this body of knowledge, on this standard. So our current thinking, and we haven't yet finalized and published a technical report on this regard, but it is in progress. Our thinking is along the lines, again, of this 37,000 being the conceptual framework within which future versions of the King reports or any national regulations and codes can be based. So providing 37,000, again, providing a conceptual framework within which the national priorities can be established against that basis. A little bit more detail, a little bit more emphasis on the various national priorities, as opposed to the global consensus on the generic conceptual principles. Then moving further on, in terms of the establishment of the standard in beyond governance as it exists today. So thinking about the standard and developing the standard, making it future-proofed. Future-proof is a word that we used quite a lot. How can this standard be applied over the next 5-10 years? Now, the ISO standards are revised every 5 years, but we needed to make sure that we weren't shooting ourselves in the foot and establishing a consensus of what good governance looks like today, when we know that these future considerations are upon us today. So the kinds of things that we looked at is looking at beyond corporate governance. We knew that the standard needed to be applicable for all types and sizes of organizations, no matter where they're located. We needed to bring the benefits of good corporate governance to all organizations internationally. And that's what we've tried to do. We also needed to consider both tangible and intangible assets. For example, purpose, organizational purpose, as being an intangible asset, and governance, but also intangible beyond the traditional intangible of brand and reputation. We also needed to consider governance in the context of the environment, the natural environment, and society. So beyond the context that organizations are established in today's world, as we've seen in today's world. So looking at the intangible assets, we have very valid evidence to demonstrate that the great stock exchanges of the world, the valuation and the market value of companies on these stock exchanges are beyond just looking at the tangible assets on the balance sheet. They're looking at also at the intangible assets, such as governance and the purpose of the organization. So this very much validates what we're trying to do in the standard. And the second aspect, of course, is, and it's largely being used in the investment world. If you haven't heard of it already, it is a big buzzword. Google it, ESG, environment, social, and governance. So in the context of governance, I just take my own approach to ESG, thinking of governance as being the leadership of the organization. So the organization itself having an impact on both the economic and natural environment, as well as society or the social impact. So the organization's impact on the environment and society, and then the environment and society's impact on the organization. So thinking of this holistically and understanding that the role of the governing body and the governance of an organization is very much in this mix of both the organization's impact on its environment and society, and natural environment and society's impact on the organization, not forgetting the context of the economic environment as well. So taking these factors into consideration in the development of the governance principles of the organization. The standard itself has a free portion and a paid for portion. So this is how ISO works. The free portion provides you with the introduction and the scope of the standard, as well as terms and definitions. Now, this is the first time that we have international agreement on the terminology or a common language for the governance of organizations. So making this freely available is very important. Here in the terms and definitions, we tackle very intricate and difficult problems, such as defining what is the governance of organizations and what is governance and a governing body, for example, and how does governance happen across an organization. These are very difficult terms to define, and we took a long time in defining them. In fact, a separate task group was established in the technical committee to deal with definitions. And this task group 6, the definitions that we have grappled with internationally and we have developed, will be applied across all the ISO standards. Of course, we were influenced by the ISO standards that already exist. So management system standards, for example, don't all have the concept of a governing body. They rather talk about top management. Now, we had to, in 37,000, consider the definition of governing body in the context of being able to explain how top management works within this concept of a governing body. Then in the standard itself, the paid for version, there are 3 aspects. The one is the conditions within which good governance should take place. So the conditions that nurture effective governance of organizations. So the conditions that should be established to promote effective governance. Then the governance principles themselves that should be applied. And there are some key aspects of practice that have been developed in there as well to guide governing bodies in their consideration of how to apply these principles. And finally, the governance outcomes that are intended for organizations to demonstrate when they are well governed. So let's look at the governance conditions. The governance conditions are in 2 parts. There's this concept of integratedness of governance across the organization, and then there's the concept of the governing body itself. In integrated governance, here we talk about delegation. The governing body and the authority and responsibilities that are conferred upon it cannot do everything itself. So it needs to delegate into the organization its authority and responsibilities for the organization to do its work. This delegation should be done effectively to ensure that the direction and parameters given are performed and fulfilled by the organization within the parameters given. So delegation needs to be effective and understood, and recognition needs to be given that someone has been delegated accountability. Again, the other aspect of accountability is being held to account and holding to account. So these key aspects of governance consideration have been explained in the standard. Also, very importantly, the difference between management and governance, and the recognition that in a single organization, people can have both roles as governors and as managers. So participating in both activities requires the separation or the recognition of when there's governing and when there's managing. Very importantly, the consideration of sustainability and sustainable development. And then in today's world, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. So in all decision-making, a condition for the long-term performance and viability of the organization over time. And in acting in the best interests of the organization, the governing body should, in everything it does, consider sustainability and sustainable development. And the definition of that, because there are so many different versions of sustainability, is described in this portion in integrated governance as a governance condition. And finally, considering stakeholders. Now, two additional names or terms of stakeholders have been pulled out in the definitions, and you'll see them in the free version of the standard. And that's member stakeholders and reference stakeholders. Member stakeholders refer to shareholders of a company or members of an organization. Now, you can understand that the terminology used for that role of participation in an organization by shareholders is different across the world and in different languages. So we needed to get consensus on what would a term be that would be reflective of that special kind of stakeholder that is influential in the governance of an organization. If we think about shareholders, shareholders can ultimately influence the governance of a company through its appointment of the governing body members or the directors of the company, through withholding certain accountability and authority for decision-making, and even to provide the purpose and define the purpose for the organization. Very, very influential governance activities are in the hands of those member stakeholders. But there's another type of stakeholder, and that's what we call a reference stakeholder. Now, a reference stakeholder are those stakeholders that the governing body chooses to include in its and to consider in its decision-making beyond general stakeholders. So these reference stakeholders we can think of as parents in a school situation. So the governing body of a school isn't necessarily mandated to consider the pupils' parents or the guardians of the scholars in the school. However, the governing body chooses to consider the input from this very powerful stakeholder body. The stakeholders are paying the fees largely, or very influential in the governance of the organization. So instead of ignoring this very relevant stakeholder group, the governing body treats this stakeholder group as a reference stakeholder and considers them in their decision-making. Other reference stakeholders could be advisory councils or advisory boards on company, to assist company boards, and scientific boards to assist a research organization, for example. So consideration of stakeholders beyond just shareholders needed the consideration of the terminology for shareholders being more than shareholders, member stakeholders and reference stakeholders, and then consideration of other relevant stakeholders. In no way is the standard intended to be read in the conjunction of a specific political system, such as a capitalistic or a social system or a communist system or whatever the system is. It's generic across those systems. So when it says that as all stakeholders should be considered, it's not in the consideration of a single economic system or political system. Rather, it's in consideration of balancing stakeholders' expectations. Then the second aspect is that of the governing body. So considering the composition of the governing body and the appointment of governing body members, and then considering the structures and the use of committees, for example, to balance power, to bring in technical aspects that not every member of the governing body, for example, necessarily needs. And then finally, the competence of the governing body members themselves. So ensuring that the composition, structure, and the competence of the governing body meets the needs of the organization. So these are the conditions that have been internationally agreed as being those factors necessary to ensure and to support and nurture effective governance of an organization. Then thinking about the principles themselves. So the standard defines a governance model, or pictorially represents the 11 principles that it has identified. In the center, it places the primary governance principle, and that's the organizational purpose and organizational values. There's recognition that behavior significantly impacts action. We think about the common phrases: good governance needs good behavior. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. So we recognize fundamentally that behavior impacts action. So that fundamental recognition is in as a primary purpose principle. So primary governance principle in the center of this governance model. The very center of the model are organizational purpose and organizational values. And guidance is given around some practices in that regard, but specifically that the organizational purpose should consider factors beyond economic purpose and consider the natural environment and society as well. The next concentric circle are called the foundational governance principles. These have been established through much research and with reference to Professors Bob Tricker, Bob Garrett, Mervyn King's work, as well as large input from John Carver's policy governance work. So a lot of research around what are these fundamental core activities with respect to governance, and bringing in together the 21st century thinking. So value generation objectives, establishing value generation objectives, internationally agreed, is core to organizational governance activities in today's world. Beyond that, establishing and dynamically engaging with the organization strategy. So delivering on the organizational purpose and value generation objectives through the organizational strategy. I just need to mention value generation objectives are established through engagement with relevant stakeholders, understanding their expectations. Then oversight. Once direction and parameters within which an organization is to operate have been established, the governing body needs to oversee and ensure that this has been performed as according to its expectations and according to how it has directed. And finally, demonstrating accountability. So through accountability, and we heard a little bit of it in the delegation, through accountability is demonstrated through essential activities of reporting. And remember here, we've got the accountability of the governing body to the organization. So the accountability to act in the best interest of the organization. So accountability to the organization and responsibility for the organization as a whole. And then through the organization to demonstrate the organization's accountability to stakeholders through reporting. So very key, intricate concerns when it comes to these 4 core governance activities. You can just imagine the amount of work it took to establish international consensus that these 4 principles are foundational to all governance activities across all types and sizes of organizations, no matter where the location. But that's not all that society is demanding of organizations today. There were other governance factors, and those governance factors we've called the enabling governance principles. And these are things like stakeholder engagement, the need to demonstrate stakeholder inclusivity, and again, not on the basis of an economic or political system, stakeholder inclusivity through stakeholder engagement. Also, the need for the leaders, for the governing body to lead ethically and effectively, and for the organization and the members of the organization itself to demonstrate ethical and effective leadership. Then understanding and recognizing the insights that data brings to organizations decision-making, not only by the organization and the organization's governing body, but also by those outside of the organization, be they good or bad actors. And then considering risk governance, talking about bad actors, the governance of risk across the organization. Now I'm going to say a little bit more about that after I've explained the principles, this being Risk Awareness Week. two very important sustainability considerations, and that's of social responsibility. And I call it long-term viability, but the standard calls it performance, viability and performance over time. So the consideration of core sustainability factors in all decisions. Now, the model is as concentric circles is to emphasize that when applying these governance principles, a governing body should do so in harmony, should apply the principles at the same time. It uses the word concurrently as opposed to in parallel meaning separate. In fact, using the terminology concurrently and integrated governance means that the governing body needs to consider all of these factors when it is governing the organization. So in harmony, concurrently, in an integrated way. And this leads to the need for a governing body to think in an integrated manner, to think systemically when it's governing the organization. Finally, the outer ring. The outer ring talks to the governance outcomes. So these are the outcomes that can be demonstrated when an organization is being well governed. And those are responsible stewardship. Responsible stewardship, the organization demonstrates the responsible stewardship of its own resources, but also those resources that it impacts in the world. So if you think about the resources beyond just financial capital and into the so-called International Integrated Reporting Councils and now the Value Reporting Council's 6 capital model as an example of beyond financial capital only. So responsible stewardship of these resources. Another governance outcome is effective performance, that the organization's stakeholders can be certain that the organization is going to perform well, is going to be successful, is going to show and demonstrate effective performance. And this effective performance being a performance over time, viable and performing over time. And finally, ethical behavior, ensuring that the governing body behaves ethically, that the members of the organization behave ethically, and that the organization behaves ethically. Now, we've seen so many ethical failures. And in fact, when we see the good governance, we very rarely see good governance in the press, but we see bad governance. So good governance isn't only about avoiding bad governance, reputational damage, but really to demonstrate good governance through responsible stewardship, behaving well ethically, and performing well, effective performance. So those are the 3 governance outcomes that internationally has been agreed are demonstrations when an organization is being well governed. I want to touch a little bit on value generation because that is not currently well established across the world's international codes. In fact, it's something quite new. We would have heard in the traditional models of strategy and policy, or policy and strategy, depending on what frame of academic background you come from. But this concept of value generation is something quite new, and it's something that the 21st century brings. And it's really touching on that ESG, sustainability and responsible stewardship of resources. So value creation, as it's a commonly used term, we'll hear a lot more about in COP26 when the world comes together in Glasgow next month. And we also hear about enterprise value creation. And that's not considering only the creation, but also the preservation and erosion of value. So considering all the factors around value and value beyond mere financial value, but value as in the eyes of the stakeholders. So value as the stakeholders determine, as opposed to just financial value. So internationally, instead of using the term value creation, the term value generation was used to better reflect the concept that all of these components, including creation, need to come together. It's the only principle that goes down into a level of detail beyond just key aspects of practices, but says that good governance, and good governance in terms of value generation, requires the governing body to get more actively involved in determining the value generation model for the organization. And that value generation model should consist of these four aspects: defining the value generation objectives of the organization. So those objectives within the concept and the understanding of the organizational purpose, of course, and the considerations of all the 11 principles of the organization, governance principles. So understanding that you're engaging stakeholders, that you're leading ethically, that you've considered risk, that you are generating and considering the generation of value, the organization's generation of value. So the governing body is very involved, should be very involved in the definition of these value generation objectives. Now, when it comes to creating the value, the organization then starts working with the governing body in the defining of the strategy, and the governing body should dynamically steer and engage with the strategy to optimally ensure that the organization is performing as required to deliver on the organizational purpose and the defined organizational value generation objectives. Then in the delivery, when the organization actually goes ahead and delivers this value through its various organizational activities and business processes, the oversight really comes in to make sure, by the governing body, to make sure that the value generation objectives are being delivered by the organization. And finally, the final portion of the value generation model is ensuring that the organization remains sustainable when the organization's value is distributed. I personally use the example of the energy companies of today having to move away from carbon-based fuels into more innovative and different types of energy production. Now, to move away from a traditional source of additional capital really requires investment. And that investment can take away from that value that's distributed to stakeholders. So, for example, perhaps an organization might determine, the governing body might determine that it's better in the organization's interest to not pay dividends to shareholders for the next 5 years and to retain that in the organization so that the organization has the resources, as responsible stewardship of those resources, to invest, to be able to change the organization's business model from carbon intensive energy into more alternative forms of energy. So that is an example of the governing body practicing value generation, applying the principle of value generation through a practice, and that practice is involved in the sustained value generation process. So this is the model for the 11 governance principles that have been internationally agreed as being those principles that governing bodies should apply. Now, the practices that the governing body uses to apply that, some key aspects of practice have been provided in the standard, but really the governing body needs to decide what is most appropriate for their organization in their context for the organization to deliver the value as intended. So the practices that the governing body applies need to be very specific to the organization concerned. So the practices are not written as shall. They're not certifiable. They are for the governing body to determine as being those most appropriate to apply these governance principles. Finally, as I said, let's just stop on the risk governance, this being Risk Awareness Week. Absolutely, ISO 37000 is well aligned, and as it should be, with ISO 31000, the risk standard. So the terminology that's established in ISO 31000 is the same definitions are used in ISO 37000. Of course, 37000 works at a different level in the organization. So where we say risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives, at a governing body level, we're thinking more along the terms of the strategic outcomes as opposed to specific objectives. So we're looking at strategic outcomes. The risk is the impact of uncertainty, the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And in our governing body level, we're talking about the strategic outcomes as being our objectives. So we get 37,000 gets direction and guidance from the risk ISO 31,000. But on direction and guidance, there are three aspects of practice that have been identified in 37,000, that the governing body is responsible for providing direction and guidance when it comes to risk management in the organization. And that direction and guidance is, as 31,000 says, is in the form of establishing the big ticket items, so the organization's risk profile. So the adoption of the enterprise risk management framework, for example, determining the tolerances and the appetites and whatever system you're using, really establishing the tone from the top in terms of the organization's approach to governance. Secondly, the key aspect of practice that's the guidance provided in ISO 37,000 is that the governing body itself should practice good risk management when it's making decisions. So the governing body itself should manage its own risk. So when it makes decisions, understand the effects of its decision-making on both the organization as well as the organization and its context within which it operates. So the governing body itself must practice good, effective risk management. And then finally, the governing body should oversee the risk management in the organization, making sure that it's effective, that is practiced throughout the organization, that it's not, where's risk management in the organization? Oh, that's that unit over there, right? We practice effective risk management throughout the organization, that it's instilled in the culture of the organization. So those are three key aspects of practice that are more established and better described than I've just done now in the standard itself. And that's all sitting within the concept and the governance principle of risk as a key enabling governance principle, such that the organization can achieve those three intended governance outcomes. So thank you very much for listening. Very comfortable, very happy, honored to be part of the Risk Awareness Week. And just a shout out to the organizers of Risk Awareness Week. Thank you so much for taking into consideration all of my constraints in recording the video today. So thank you very much.